just went over?
Whenever you're set.
Hi, I'm Mariah COF has always been a controversy, but it is especially relevant now when we are in the midst of a war that has brought it to the surface. So in light of recent issues our nation has had on the subject of torture, I would like to propose this proposition. Torture used in the prosecution and interrogation of criminals fails to be effective in retrieving accurate and usable information. I'll be using 3 supporting claims. 1, that torture rarely yields adequate information or fulfills the torturer's purpose for the act. 2, that torture is useless in the prosecution of criminals. And 3, that domination and control fails to be effective. Real power in interrogation comes from intelligence. For my first supporting claim, that torture rarely yields adequate information or fulfills the torturer's purpose for the act. From the book Constitutional Limits on Coercive Interrogation by Amos A. Guerra. Experience has shown that information received from a tortured detainee is overwhelmingly inaccurate, unreliable, and of minimal value in preventing acts of terrorism. Douglas A. Johnson, Executive Director of the Center for Victims of Torture, said that nearly every client at the Center for Victims of Torture, when subjected to torture, did confess to a crime that they did not commit, gave up extraneous information, or supplied names of innocent friends or colleagues in order to their torturers. He goes on to say, it is a great source of shame for our clients who would have told us, who tell us that they would have said anything their tormentors wanted them to say in order to make the pain stop. So we have victims of torture themselves admitted to giving inadequate information and inaccurate information to make to their torturers. And then Johnson also claims that well-trained interrogators within the military, the FBI, and the police have testified that torture does not work, is unreliable, and distracting from the hard work of interrogation. So ultimately, we have all these trained interrogators from reliable sources like the FBI and the military and the police telling us that torture is not reliable or effective in getting information or intelligence, as well as actual victims of torture telling us that they told false claims when they were being tortured. And then my second claim, which is torture is useless in the prosecution of a criminal. According to Philip Carter, who is a former Army officer, any information gained through torture will most certainly be excluded from court in any criminal prosecution of the tortured defendant. And he also says that the use of torture to obtain statements may make those statements and any evidence gathered as a result of those statements inadmissible in the trials of other defendants as well. So ultimately, the use of torture undermines the effort to put the accused behind bars, and actually the use of torture in interrogation may allow some defendants to win acquittals. So any intelligence gained from torture, assuming that information is reliable in the first place, will not be allowed in a criminal case and can actually hurt the chances of putting a defendant behind bars. And my third claim, that domination and control fails to be effective, real power in interrogation comes from intelligence. Matthew Alexander, who is an Air Force veteran, explains how his tactics of cultural understanding, tolerance, compassion, and intellect has earned him more useful information and success in numbers and acts of torture would. There was a drop in suicide bombings in Iraq in the spring at 2 points in the spring and summer of 2006 as a direct result of his interrogation methods, meaning that based on the information that he gathered from his tolerant and peaceful interrogation methods, he was able to effectively reduce suicide bombings. So he created a positive result using nothing but his team's intelligence. And so it can be said then that trained interrogators are more effective in the retrieval of information from a detainee than those who practice torture. And so I hope you can agree with me that torture used in the prosecution and interrogation of criminals fails to be effective in retrieving accurate and usable information.
Can you give me the time? I don't have a timer.
It was 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
Okay. All right, you identify the subject, but I'm not sure that the claim is still focusing on where the controversy is. For example, the whole second point, I don't think there's any dispute about that. If the point is to prosecute in a criminal court, especially in the United States, the results would never be admissible. That's taken as a given. So there's not really any controversy on that point. On the first point, I think that you do a nice job talking about why there is a futility in torture. You've got an okay example that you cite, but you also have the testimony that I think is pretty effective. And I like the summary that you did right before you went to the second point, trying to emphasize that idea. The secondary claims, they're all labeled pretty clearly, although sometimes the phrasing on them is a little complicated, and for an oral presentation, it should probably be simpler. You did a good job citing sources for the most part. I do think on the last citation that it does sound a little self-serving. If there's an outside authority that made these claims about the captain's investigation, I think that would be a little bit stronger than the captain saying these things about himself. I'm not exactly sure what the context of that whole discussion was, whether it appeared in a news article, a book that this person wrote. So context is a little bit hard to evaluate. I'm not saying that the evidence is necessarily bad. I'm just saying that it's, when it comes to credibility, we've got this guy saying, well, my kind and gentle, interrogations stopped all of these suicide bombings in 2006. And I'm going, okay, well, that sounds pretty convincing if that is in fact true. But it's, like I said, it's all self-reported. So there may be a little bit of ego involvement there that is problematic. All right, thank you.